All due respect to the efforts of America's timekeepers, seems a little excessive.
The countdown clock telling me we are now 23 hours and 48 minutes and 50 seconds.
If we had a countdown clock, I wouldn't need to tell you this. Because we're now less than 24 hours away from the start.
We do.
Oh, good. I was kidding.
It is Europe's final countdown.
Now 21 hours and counting. That is the clock on your screen.
With the vote clock showing 2 minutes, 17 seconds.
We're counting down also to tonight's CNN Libertarian Town Hall.
Our countdown to 4th of July.
Countdown to Shark Week.
20 minutes set on the countdown clock, starting now.
Countdown, that's when you go 3, 2, 1.
It's the final countdown.
Tonight on this very newsy, posh and spicy Thursday show, an immigration deadlock, a gun control standoff, and Donald Trump's policy plan. But first, a Brexit referendum scan. Polls are now closed in the United Kingdom, where voters today weighed in on whether to cut ties with the European Union. We aren't going to know the results for a few more hours, but the outcome could, of course, have a dramatic effect on, first and foremost, the future of Europe, but also here in America and in American politics. The vote comes on the very same day that Donald Trump is taking a break from the campaign trail and heading to Scotland, where he's checking on a couple of his golf courses. The presumptive Republican presidential nominee has publicly supported the idea of the UK leaving the EU with Hillary Clinton, siding with President Obama. President Obama, of course, in April went to London, stood beside the British Prime Minister, and got on the Remain train, which is where Hillary Clinton is as well. Joining us now, our London colleague, Bloomberg reporter Neera Chayich. Neera, the polls have just closed there. Tell us what you know.
Well, very little at the moment in terms of turnout and how the results are going to look. As you say, the polls have just closed here in the UK. We're not going to get an official exit poll in the way we usually do with a general election, but we might see some other private polls come out in the next couple of hours. We are keeping an eye out on that. And then the first results are going to start coming in about 2 hours' time. We're scheduled to get the Isles of Scilly and Gibraltar at midnight BST. Of course, these are often approximate times, so they might not be at that exact time, but the bulk of the results will come at 3:30 a.m. The results for what has been one of the most divisive votes in British history, the vote on whether to remain in the European Union or not. Of course, a lot of issues with Remain very much campaigning, talking about the impact a Leave vote could have on the UK economy, and the Leave camp really focusing on immigration and on other issues like sovereignty. Back to you.
Okay, Neera Chayich in London, thank you very much. So, John, we have no idea what the results will be, so what is the impact?
Well, look, this is obviously first and foremost a European issue and an issue related to the European Union and to Britain. There is, as you suggested in your lead-in, there's an American component to it. What has driven the Leave forces are a bunch of big global phenomena that are happening all across Western democracies. The moves, the populist impulse, the anti-immigrant impulse, the isolationist impulse, to some extent the nativist impulse. We've seen that in Donald Trump's campaign here. We've seen it in the Leave campaign there. It's a big test, it seems to me, of that movement. And again, it's not just the UK and America, of how strong is that movement? At this moment in our politics in Western democracies, how strong is it? This is the first and biggest and most important test. When we see the answer to that, it may give us some sense of whether this global phenomenon is ebbing or flowing, waxing or waning.
I don't think it's going to have anything to do with the American election, either in its impact or its representations, because it's a totally different situation. This is a specific vote about a specific win. I don't think it's going to impact the economy either way, however the vote goes. There could be some short-term things, but I think the markets have already pretty much figured out they're ready for anything. And there's so many issues in this American election. I just can't see this actually having an impact, even though the two presidential candidates are on different sides.
Well, I think, look, I mean, we have no idea what the financial markets have been relatively optimistic about the notion that Remain would win for a while. If Leave actually ends up winning, it will be surprising, both because it will defy the polls.
But my guess is the markets will just absorb it.
Well, it may or may not. Again, luckily, neither one of us is a financial market expert. I hope that that's true. Certainly, the U.S. couldn't use a market shock. But I do think if Leave wins, I think just the narrative of what's happening in this country, you'll be able to look at that and say, man, those impulses that I talked about before that have been fueling the Trump movement will not change our electoral outcome. But you'll be able to look and say those forces are on the march in a way that
we already know they're on the march because Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump did really well. I don't know if that means they can lead to a majority.
Well, we'll see about that. Okay, we'll talk more about the Brexit vote later in the show with Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwait. Here at home, the gun control gridlock on Capitol Hill continued today. This afternoon, a test vote on a bill sponsored by Senator Susan Collins, which would have prevented people on terrorist watch lists from purchasing firearms, didn't receive the 60 votes it would need to overcome a filibuster, though it did get a support from a majority of the chamber. That vote followed a remarkable and at times chaotic 25-hour sit-in protest by House Democrats on the floor of their chamber, which started yesterday and ended around lunchtime today. The protest, led by civil rights icon Congressman John Lewis, has some history with sit-ins, created some unflattering optics for House Speaker Paul Ryan, who spent last night trying to finish legislative business before adjourning for the 4th of July recess a few days early. This morning, at his weekly Capitol Hill press conference, Ryan called the whole confrontation an inappropriate ploy by Democratic House members.
If this is not a political, then why are they trying to raise money off of this? Off of a tragedy? What they're called for failed in a committee in the House. The reason I call this as a stunt is because they know this isn't going anywhere. It already failed in the Senate. They may not like this fact, but this bill couldn't even get 50 votes in the United States Senate, let alone 60. I don't think this should be a very proud moment for democracy or for the people who stage these stunts.
Paul Ryan not looking particularly cheerful there. This was kind of an unprecedented thing that happened on the floor of the House yesterday. So my question for you, a lot of discussion about guns recently. What are the political fallout from what happened for both for Ryan and for the gun control debate? And where does the thing go now?
Incredible passions and energy and I would say gutsiness on the part, not just of the House Democrats, but of the ones who, the people who've cheered them on, including a lot of people in the media who support their agenda. Paul Ryan has got on his side a lot of people in the country who don't think this is good legislation, who care about the Second Amendment, and also the rules of the House. And the notion that, yes, this is a cause that shows as popular in the polling. Yes, it's a cause people feel passionately about, but without rules in the House, you have chaos. And so there's a lot of strong emotions on both sides. I think that this shows that the people who would like additional gun control measures are as empowered and as energized and as organized as they've ever been. And that means there may be more change in the short term than I thought just a few days ago.
Right. I think this guarantees the House Democrats are going to bring this back after recess in a big way. The gun control, I believe now, in these relatively modest forms, let's be clear, is going to be at the center of a lot of campaigns over the course of the summer and the fall, I think. And the place where I think Democrats have the whip hand, or at least the better argument, they have the same argument. Doesn't mean they're going to win this argument, but politically, in the country, wherever you stand on this issue, the notion of doing your job, taking votes on things. In the same way that I think a lot of Americans find it frustrating, whether they're liberal or conservative, that you can't get a Supreme Court nominee to get a hearing or get a vote. Like, why the Senate, why the House can't just proceed? If you don't like these measures, vote for it. Vote no. Vote against the measures. I think that's a powerful argument that could sway a fair number of people in congressional elections going forward. Again, regardless of where you are on this particular issue.
Although, as Ryan pointed out, if they want this, they could do a discharge position if they've got a majority.
Well, they should. Then they should. I can't imagine that won't be something they may consider doing. I mean, there's a lot of interesting discussion last night, I know you know, about whether or not these bills, a lot of these House Democrats at least claim they think that these houses got a vote, they would have passed easily, and that Ryan's just trying to protect a certain number, a relatively small number of House Republicans who know where their constituencies actually are.
I still think this is not going to happen without the president calling Paul Ryan directly. See if he does it. Okay. All right. Supreme Court split 4-4 today in a case that was challenging President Obama's immigration plan that was leaving in place. The decision leaves in place a lower court ruling that blocks President Obama's executive order that was intended to shield as many as 5 million undocumented immigrants from deportation. Shortly after the court ruled, President Obama had this to say in the White House briefing room.
This is election year, and during election years, politicians tend to use the immigration issue to scare people with words like amnesty in hopes that it will whip up votes. Keep in mind that millions of us, myself included, go back generations in this country with ancestors who put in the painstaking effort to become citizens.
Both the presidential candidates also weighed in. Hillary Clinton put out a campaign statement that read in part, quote, "This decision is a stark reminder of the harm Donald Trump would do to our families, our communities, and our country. Trump has pledged to repeal President Obama's executive actions on his first day in office. He's called Mexican immigrants, quote, rapists and murderers, and he's called for creating a deportation force to tear 11 million people away from their families and their homes." Donald Trump's statement said this: "The election and the Supreme Court appointments that come with it will decide whether or not we have a border and hence a country." Clinton has pledged to expand Obama's executive amnesty, hurting poor African American and Hispanic workers by giving away their jobs and federal resources to illegal immigrant labor while making us all less safe. So, John, how is this Supreme Court decision, which again upholds the lower court ruling against the president, what impact is that going to have in the presidential race?
Well, of course, it's a decision by non-decision, right? It's a 4-4 split. So it just points out how important this last ninth seat is on the Supreme Court. That has always raised the stakes for this presidential election and given both candidates, in some sense, a powerful card to play. This is the future of the country. Rests on who gets elected next in some of these areas. Rests on who gets in the White House next and gets to maybe appoint that ninth justice. Look, I think that the politics of immigration, given the nature and the demography of the country, favor Democrats, and I think that Hillary Clinton is playing a winning hand here in terms of driving Hispanic turnout, which is going to be huge in terms of her ability to beat Donald Trump.
The only advantage I think this gives Trump, because I think it largely does help energize Hillary Clinton in states that she could use the help, is it allows Donald Trump to talk about immigration not in terms of the wall. The wall has become such a hot button issue. It allows him to maybe make an appeal on the use of executive orders, which certainly at least energizes the Republican base, and also the question of the border. So to the extent immigration is a winning issue for Republicans, I think this gives Donald Trump a better chance than just talking about the wall to make it so.
I'm sort of fascinated by, we haven't really heard Trump talk about the wall much recently, and I'm wondering whether, it's obviously intentional. It's not an accident. I'm wondering to the extent to which he will go back to the wall, or the extent to which he can escape the wall, even if he doesn't go back to it.
More likely he can escape it. Yeah, that's in his interest.
Yeah, I wonder if that's the case. It's just a little unclear. This is going to be another case, though, where between President Obama and Hillary Clinton, both on the same side, pushing this issue in a really hard way. Again, I think it's hard to imagine. I can see how it can play to Trump's benefit in a small way. It plays Democrats' advantage, I think, in a much bigger way.
I agree, and certainly in the short term. When we come back, Hillary Clinton has another big endorsement day. But first, these words from our sponsors.
Hillary Clinton's campaign today announced more than 50 endorsements from business leaders. Among them were some big-time Republican names like Jim Sassoni, who worked in the White House for Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and Dan Akerson, former chairman and CEO of General Motors. On the show yesterday, we mentioned that Clinton picked up the endorsement of former Bush 41 National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft. So, Mark, the crossover endorsements, we predicted for a long time that Hillary Clinton would be rolling out endorsements, and many of them from Republicans. Do you think that, given the nature of this race, that the endorsements from Republican CEOs or from Republican national security stalwarts are more damaging to Donald Trump or give Clinton more of an advantage?
I think the ones that are going to matter the most are the ones come from very famous people nationally, but also from state people. I think you're going to see a fair amount of Ohio Republicans who don't have any national credibility or reputation, shouldn't say credibility. All these matter. They're unusual. They speak to the alienation that certain segments of the party have from Trump. It doesn't mean he can't win. Right. But it is a way to drive news cycles, and there are many more coming.
Right. I mean, I've said yesterday, and I continue to believe that I think that the questions about Trump's fitness and readiness to be commander-in-chief are a huge problem for him, something he has to overcome if he's going to win. But it is the case that he is a businessman who touts his business skills and abilities constantly as one of his main credential for being president of the United States. If Hillary Clinton continues to roll out, if she becomes the candidate of big business, Fortune 500 CEOs across parties in a bipartisan way, it becomes clear that she has the support of most of the business community. I think that's just a huge asset for her going forward. I can't really discern which one is a bigger asset, but that's a really big deal for her. As you know, historically, Democrats who are the candidate of big business tend to be winning Democrats.
You know, Bill Clinton got endorsements for some prominent business folks in 1992. It made a really big difference symbolically. Yeah. And, of course, it affects fundraising because a lot of these business folks are people who are bundlers.
Right, and Barack Obama did the same thing, helped him too.
All right. As we've told you, House Speaker Paul Ryan has been rolling out a lot of policy plans over the last few weeks on health care, poverty, several other issues. The Wall Street Journal today published a couple of op-eds along the same lines. One was by Karl Rove, one by Dan Henninger. And they say that it would be a good idea for Donald Trump if he would simply embrace these proposals out on the campaign trail in order to cover over the fact that he's not put out very much policy and in order to unite the party. Here's what Henninger wrote. The House agenda is the Trump Rosetta Stone. It is an off-the-shelf template for getting through the next 5 months. It is a way for the party's nominee and its stressed-down ballot candidates to sing from the same hymnal rather than threaten to stab each other in the back. And Karl Rove wrote this about the House policy efforts. They said they're vital to GOP's success in November and may determine Mr. Trump's political fortunes. The shame is that he's making their work harder. So, John, how likely it is, do you think, that Trump would embrace the Ryan agenda, or is there some downside to it for him?
If he's smart, he will go with what Mr. Henninger and Mr. Rove say, and he'll embrace most, if not all of it. Obviously, the immigration pieces he disagrees with. There are places where he and Ryan trade. He won't embrace the whole thing. I don't think he would have to embrace the whole thing. Right now, he has, to my knowledge, no real policy shop. He has no real policies fleshed out in any way that we normally consider a presidential candidate to have policies. He needs some if he's going to be taken seriously. And because of the fact that the Ryan thing, though people will have differences of opinion about how good those policies are, they're credible, real agenda. It would help. I think, it sounds crazy to say that you should outsource this stuff as presidential candidate, but given where Trump is right now, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's also something that is a safe place to be, and he can say, as I suspect he's going to with the party platform, I don't agree with everything, but I agree with the broad strokes. The other area has to do with entitlement reform and spending cuts, and the Ryan plans are vague enough on those things that I don't think that would cause him a problem.
Well, it seems like there's also a political advantage here, too, right? Because the question of how much Ryan is going to be, to maintain the Ryan endorsement and not have Ryan attacking him all the time, by embracing much of the Ryan agenda, it might help him soften some of Ryan's tendency to want to criticize him when he says controversial things. That would be a good thing for Trump, too.
Safe harbor.
All right. Up next, Congressman Steve Israel joins us to talk about his role in that dramatic 25-hour House sit-in right after this.
guest just got back from leading the final hours of a 25-hour Democratic sit-in on the House floor over legislation related to guns. Joining us now from the Cannon Rotunda is the congressman from New York, Congressman Steve Israel. Congressman, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. Sorry about the voice. I worked the late shift last night.
That's right. You look pretty well rested, although I take the voice. Congressman Ryan, Speaker Ryan was pretty defiant today. So tell me, after all that effort, what your best case scenario now is for going forward.
Well, our best case scenario is that Republicans are now going to leave Congress. They're going home on vacation, and they're going to face some anger in their districts. Their constituents are going to want to know why they left for vacation without even voting on sensible legislation like no fly, no buy. They could have voted for it. They could have voted against it. They chose not only not to vote, but to leave Washington early because they didn't even want to continue the week's work. And so they're going to spend a week in their districts feeling some heat. Then they're going to come back on July 5th, and they're going to feel some more heat.
Okay, Congressman, talk a little bit about that heat. What's that heat going to look like from your side of the aisle?
Well, we said at the beginning of this week that we were going to use all the tools in our toolbox, and some of those tools would be sharp, and some would be blunt, and some would be sharp and blunt to try and force a vote on no fly, no buy. We said if we didn't get the vote, that Republicans return to their districts at their own peril. And now you're going to see next week the use of similar tools to make sure that Republicans' constituents know that they wouldn't even allow us to have a vote on this bill. No matter how they may have felt about it, they wouldn't even allow us to have a vote. Then they're going to come back on July 5th for a third consecutive week of some heat on this issue, because this is one of the most important public policy issues we have.
But again, Congressman, does that mean you're thinking about resuming a sit-in as soon as Republicans get back to Capitol Hill? Is that the kind of thing you might do?
I'm going to be very honest with you. I don't really reveal the playbook on national television, but we did tell the Republicans early on. We gave them notice on Monday. We told them that they really should give us a vote, and we were going to use every tool we had. I think they learned this week that we're willing to dip into that toolbox, use those tools, and do what needs to be done. The minority, as you know, we have very few rights in the United States Congress. One of our rights is to put pressure and heat on the majority. That's what we did in Washington. We're going to do it next week in their districts, and we'll keep doing it until we get the vote that we deserve.
Congressman, stipulate that you all feel passionately about it. You feel you have public opinion on your side, and there's emotion about recent events. But what's the threshold for not just going a more standard route, say a discharge petition, and doing what you all did last night, which is basically using civil disobedience to disrupt the House floor? When is that appropriate as compared to the normal tactics that are available under the rules?
We've tried the discharge petition. In fact, we have 180 members of Congress, including 2 Republicans, on a discharge petition. We have tried hearings. We've tried all of the usual and customary routes to get a vote, and all of those routes have been closed off to us, despite the fact that between 80 and 90% of the American people support this bill. We've tried bipartisanship. It hasn't worked. And so the Republicans have put us in a position of breaking decorum. And that is what we did. I'll admit it. We broke decorum last night. But sometimes you have to break rules for a greater good. And this bill is a greater good.
Congressman, let me ask you a question about precedent here. You know, you've broken decorum. You've done something that has not been done in a very, very, very long time. Does it not occur to you that you have any concern that having set this precedent now, that a day will come in which Democrats will be back in the majority in the House, and that Republicans will look back to this day and say, I remember when Democrats did this when they thought their cause was righteous, and they will adopt the tactics of civil disobedience to advance their ends?
That is their right. If they were to feel mistreated by a Democratic majority, of course, that's their right, and I would respect it, and I would even support it. The fact of the matter is that when Democrats were in the majority, I can't think of any instance where we absolutely refused to allow Republicans to even have a hearing on a bill. In this case, this is a bipartisan bill. Paul Ryan decided to shut us down. He was so afraid of the bill, he left Washington early last night. We were supposed to be in session until tomorrow. On Wednesday night, he said, we're getting out of town. When you have that kind of resistance, you have to use, shall we say, non-traditional recourse, and that's what we did last night.
Congressman, it's the case that you did get a vote in committee, right?
On the King-Thompson bill, no, there hasn't been a vote in committee. They will not allow this bill to advance, despite the fact that it has 111 co-sponsors and 180 people on the discharge petition.
In the end, what's your attitude towards Speaker Ryan's attitude that he portrayed in his press conference? Do you have sympathy for his position?
I do sympathize with him. I think, this is deja vu all over again. This is what John Boehner went through. I think Paul Ryan wants to do the right thing. I think he actually agrees with the 75% of NRA members who support this bill. But he is a captive of a small group within his caucus that he believes may topple him if he demonstrates some bipartisanship. And so just like John Boehner, Paul Ryan showed that he is ineffective and as a result had to literally get his caucus to escape Capitol Hill last night.
Okay, Congressman Israel, after a long day, long night, thank you very much for joining us. When we come back, Brexit for dinner. You'll see what that tastes like right after this.
Today's the day that you can vote on Britain's future in Europe. I think Britain will be stronger, safer and better off if we stay in Europe. Today's the day, so get out there and vote.
That was British Prime Minister David Cameron on Snapchat. He can't be on TV campaigning in Britain, apparently. He was urging the Brits to go out and vote to remain in the EU today. The polls are now closed across the United Kingdom, where voters weighed in on whether Britain should, in fact, exit the European Union. A YouGov online survey, which asked UK citizens how they voted today, was just released. It shows 52% voted remain, while 48% voted leave. This is just one poll, of course, and it's also an online poll, and these aren't official results, so you should take it all with a big pinch of salt. Here to talk with us about that Brexit referendum, again, for the second time in just a few days, Bloomberg editor-in-chief John Micklethwaite, and much more pleasingly, Bonnie Quinn, anchor of Bloomberg Markets. Great to see you guys both here. You just said that the word of the day today, Bonnie, is asymmetry. How so?
Well, basically, for markets, it's an asymmetric outcome in the sense that if it does happen to become a leave vote, which could still very much happen, we've just only seen the polls close, so we have no idea, no matter what the politicians are saying, what's actually going to be the outcome, then it would be a very asymmetric decision for markets. So the downside would be probably tremendous, because we've seen sterling rally about 10 big figures, 10 cents in the last 7 sessions. That would probably all be erased, and you'd see a lot of market turmoil. Asymmetric also in the sense of, you know, politically asymmetric, because if you vote to leave, you're gone, it's sayonara, and if you vote to stay, you can still leave in the future.
That's entirely true, and actually I think the fall in sterling would be much higher, because most people thought it would have a 15% fall, so maybe another kind of 10, 20 cents on top of that. It would be a huge thing, and currency traders are sitting up there waiting in sort of mild terror in case this happens.
Now,
people are sleeping in their offices.
Yeah.
Very similar to you.
Very similar to how we are at Bloomberg every day. Do you think the financial markets implications of this would be really bad if it turns out that leave happens?
Yes.
How bad?
Straightforward.
How bad?
You'd expect the pound to go down by 20x cents, probably more than that. It's just under 150 at the moment. Some people say that if leave were to happen, people are given numbers like 115 to the dollar, and that's a huge seismic change. It probably wouldn't be that far. People talk about 130, but even that, in terms of a place where millions are bet, billions are bet on just a few kind of dimes difference, that's a huge deal.
Many reasons why it would weaken as well, not only because of the short-term speculation, the bearish bets on sterling, but also because longer term, you're talking about huge implications for British trade, British headquartered companies with subsidiaries in Europe. What would be the regulations for them? Would they move their headquarters? Colm Kelleher of Morgan Stanley was just one who told Bloomberg 2 days ago that of course they'd move their headquarters to Dublin or to Frankfurt. He hadn't decided yet.
If you were a British organisation that employed an Irish person, that is one thing you might have to think about. There are all kinds of complications.
You're here and not there, but I know you're monitoring and in touch. How emotional a vote has this been, not just today, but in the run-up as compared to other British elections?
It was getting massively emotional until Joe Cox was murdered. Then the temperature went down again. But still, there are people, there are people for whom Britain leaving the European Union is one of the great causes of their life. I'm related to some of them. They have sat and thought, often for quite honourable reasons. They're fed up with the regulation. They think that they want to take back their sovereignty. Other people, for less honourable reasons, they don't like immigrants or whatever. But there are people for whom this has been the big crusade. A lot of people within the Conservative Party, they thought this is the big single thing that Britain's done wrong for the past 20, 30 years. And so it really is a kind of single issue passion. It's the equivalent of having a referendum on abortion in America. It's that type of thing, where for some people this matters enormously.
And how has that manifested itself on television and in discussion forums?
I think in the sheer passion and fury before, and it rose and rose and rose. And as I was saying to you the other day, it rose and rose and rose, and then we had this. The murder of Joe Cox changed a lot of the rhetoric, and everything dampened down. But there are also countless politicians. David Cameron, you just saw, his future depends wholly on this.
You also saw it in the sense of who campaigned with whom, right? You had David Cameron and Jeremy Corbyn, for example, stumping together. That'd be the equivalent of something, like Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton going out together to pitch on one issue. You would never see that in the course of a normal election cycle or a normal voting cycle. So that was another...
It's made very odd bedfellows. I think that's...
Bonnie mentions Donald Trump, and we talked a little bit earlier on the show about this. I mean, this move, the kind of passions that have been stirred up in this are not unique to Britain.
No.
They're all across Europe. They're in a lot of Western democracies. Fear of immigration, protectionism, isolationism. Do you think that if the Remain vote wins, those will subside to a large extent in Britain? I mean, they have been on the rise, right? Not just in France and Britain, other places. Will that put kind of a cap on those things, or will they still continue to bubble in a really dangerous way?
Unless Remain wins by a very large margin, a big enough margin, say, I don't know, 55, 60%, that Cameron can say, look, we've solved this. Let's just put this to bed. But if it's a narrow margin, people will come back and say, look, it was all due to that horrible murder. Otherwise, we might have won. And there will be continual, somewhat Trumpian fury about immigration and all those things. Those sort of issues aren't going away. The one sort of lesson, there are lessons, I think, for the American bit. There's that element about, we all worried on the Remain side, people worried about a terrorist incident. Actually, in fact, the murder seems to switch people the other way. There are also issues, people can get very, very angry about these things, but when they're confronted in that last moment in the polling booth, they seem, if these exit polls or non-exit polls are even a little bit correct, people seem to have said, I don't want to try the unknown. And that will be something that if I was Donald Trump, I would look at.
Yeah, inertia tends to win the day, but also the idea that you would have many, many years of uncertainty and you wouldn't immediately have an exit. You'd have to invoke this Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, at which point you're out of the club, and then other EU leaders are basically deciding your fate, because then it's 2 years of negotiations and you're not in the room with those EU leaders.
So let me ask you both just really quickly. If Leave turns out to win, and against all expectations at this moment, what happens tomorrow morning?
Well, next week, EU leaders meet. Tomorrow morning, David Cameron probably has a very hasty meeting with his cabinet members and decides what to do. He probably, is out of a job at that point.
Probably very close to out of a job, and the markets will be going crazy. And that will actually have impact well beyond. That is where it suddenly starts affecting the world economy and all those things, because it has been this, you know, in the background, the past few days, markets have begun to recover because people have begun to breathe a sigh of relief. This was close, or the idea of a leave vote is still somewhat close to a Lehman moment, or one of those potential things that could upset a lot of other things.
But to be clear, tomorrow morning Britain still would be a member of the EU until there was a vote taken to withdraw.
But if any of us, with, you know, if you're buying a house in London, one of the many houses, you know, you would decide, you would sit there and think it's going to collapse in value.
And central bankers have their alarms set very early. The ECB and the Federal Reserve, they've all said that they're going to be there in case of liquidity moments.
All right,
London real estate is not going to collapse. Don't worry.
Right, Vonnie Quinn, you're fantastic. John Micklethwaite, I'm praying for all of your vast real estate holdings, both in London and in the countryside. Stay with Bloomberg for the latest on this huge story. Up next, we'll talk to Ted Cruz's campaign manager, Jeff Rowe, and a former Trump advisor, Michael Caputo. If you're watching us in Washington, D.C., you can also listen to us on the radio at Bloomberg 99.1 FM. We'll be right back.
Our next guest tonight is two guests tonight. Jeff Rowe, the former campaign manager for Ted Cruz presidential campaign. He's in our Washington bureau. And here in studio, Michael Caputo, former advisor to the Trump campaign, who resigned earlier this week after he put a thing on Twitter celebrating the firing of Trump's campaign manager. They're both claimed to be fans of the program, so we're happy to have them here. Jeff Rowe and Michael Caputo. Gentlemen, thank you. Jeff Rowe, just to be clear, Michael is, despite leaving the campaign, still a big supporter of Donald Trump. What is your public posture on whether you're a Trump man now?
Well, it's been 6 weeks, so I'm still waiting to see. His speech yesterday took a big step forward, and along with his position on judges, which today we got the reminder of how important that is, makes a real stark reaction of what this campaign will be about and what the results of it will mean for America. But I'm waiting to see, along with millions of Americans and Republicans, to see how Donald conducts the campaign and earns our vote.
Michael, you hear that from a guy who's obviously a very conservative Republican who says he's still not sure. How does that make you feel? And think about the challenge for the Trump campaign.
Well, I think there's a lot of people that are sitting just like Jeff who are waiting for more of a few more points on this line to call it a trend. But I'm very confident that we're going to see a whole different kind of campaign after the decisions made on Monday. I believe with Paul Manafort completely in charge, and he's putting up the structure that he's always wanted to put up. And I think Donald Trump's going to get the campaign he deserves, and skeptics are going to start to see that this is something that they can get behind.
Michael, the campaign is right now going to go to the May fundraising numbers are very, very bad in terms of on the ground, very, very weak at this moment. Mr. Trump has said he doesn't really care about data or data analytics, a lot of tools of kind of traditional modern campaigns. How much of that do you put at Corey Lewandowski's feet?
I think some of it, but really it's not about Corey Lewandowski. It's about where this campaign is going forward. I think we also saw news yesterday that Mr. Trump probably broke most records for online fundraising. By the way, Jeff, you guys did good online as well, but it's really tremendous. We got $3 million in 24 hours in online fundraising, and he's never used that list before. Democrats better be ready for about a $20 million a month online fundraising churn from his list. And I also think the mechanics of fundraising, the things that were, to be put in place, the events and the internal processes that need to be put in place are now in place. And the decisions that were made on Monday, moved away some of the wood that was in the way, and we're going to see more and more success in fundraising. On the ground, you're going to see a lot more hiring. There are a lot of people being considered with the decisions on Monday. Those hires will happen. And a lot more things that you would expect from a traditional campaign are going to be put up from here forward.
Jeff, let me ask you this question. You're a guy who is a big fan of data, of targeting, of ground game, of all of the most kind of leading edge campaign techniques. That was your kind of stock in trade. When you have, I know you're on the outside, but as an observer of the Trump campaign, the statements it's made, what we know about it from the reporting on it, and again, Mr. Trump's own assertions, how worried are you about the state of that campaign? Does that look like a campaign in a state of crisis to you, as it does to some Republican operatives?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that without data, without online fundraising, they kicked my butt anyway, and that's on top of us raising $93 million, which was a record at the time, or a record for Republican primaries, getting 8 million votes, and Mr. Trump has a way to control the news cycle, and I believe they'll be able to put it together, but they do have to get going right now. The time that where this really boils down to is data and analytics and ground really equates to about 1.5, 2.5, 3.5 points, depending on how the Democrats are doing it. And the Democrats are clearly doing it very well because they've won so many campaigns. The Clintons won so many campaigns within the margin of error. And so that typically means that the ground game made the difference. And so I think they have time. The RNC has done a good job ramping up. It's a candidate generic model, so they'll need to make it Trump specific. But if you look at the polls the last few days, I mean, for what has been 6.5 weeks of pretty tough stuff for the Trump campaign, he's still in margin of error or up in places where you'd need to be. And in fact, he's doing better than you would anticipate him doing in places like Pennsylvania and others. So I think there's time to catch up, but they do have to get going very quickly.
You guys are coming back in the next block, so let's rapid round end here. Smartest pick for vice president for Trump would be who?
Tom Cotton.
Okay. Jeff Rowe, smartest pick for Trump?
Anybody besides Newt Gingrich.
All right. The smartest thing the Clinton campaign's doing right now is what?
Keeping the pressure up on Donald Trump. And I think right now, actually, they're going to start getting some pushback.
Jeff Rowe?
Yeah, I think they're probably on-ground mechanics is what you can see right now that they're doing the best.
Keynote speaker at the convention, who'd be the smartest pick?
It's hard for me to say, but I wish I could see Jack Kemp up there speaking.
Jeff Rowe, go with somebody alive, if you would.
Yeah, let me take a little different direction. If you want to rally the conservatives, put a stamp on our party, and take this into a general election with everybody fully motivated, I think Ted Cruz should have a big role in the convention.
Okay. You guys stand by. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the Cleveland Convention and whether there's going to be more excitement there than usual right after this.
We're back with Jeff Rowe, the captain of Ted Cruz's presidential campaign, and Michael Caputo, a former advisor to Donald Trump. Mr. Caputo, you were, in your capacity as an advisor to the Trump campaign, working pretty hard out in Cleveland, Ohio, getting ready for the convention. Just give us a sense of how prepared the campaign was for the possibility of a significant challenge to Mr. Trump's nomination.
Well, you know, the whole caucus operations division is the Trump office in the convention, and they've been preparing from the very beginning for a load of chicanery. They've been expecting something. We're hopeful that it's not going to happen, but the communications team we put in place is mostly Army veterans, combat veterans, people that are good under pressure, solid communicators with a lot of Capitol Hill and campaign experience, more veterans than on any other team in politics. And also, boy, I'll tell you, our floor operations team is going to be stellar. There's not going to be anyone to compare it to in recent times. Doug Davenport, who's going to head that up, is an expert beyond all other experts. So I think if somebody wants to play a game in Cleveland, they better bring an army.
Jeff, you were, for a period of time, preparing to be one of those chicanery inducers when we thought there was a chance there was going to be a contested convention and Ted Cruz was going to be one of the contestees. What's your sense at this moment of the degree of energy, organization, motivation of those who would still like to try to dump Trump?
Oh, I think there's some there. I think the last 6 weeks that we've gone through is really what's put this in motion and gave it energy. And I think depending on how the campaign progresses in the next 3 weeks is really going to be determinative about how much energy there is. I mean, essentially, Republicans want to win. And when we see what has happened in the last 6 weeks, we're very concerned that will actually be the case. But I categorize it when I talk to people about this is that it's probably 50% more organized, more disciplined, better funded than you would hope. And it's probably 25% less than you would fear. But there's some talented people involved. They have some money. But I think our posture is that Donald Trump won the nomination, and he's going to be our nominee. And if other things happen, then that's out of our control. We're not in talks, coordination, or participation with the effort. But in my estimation, Trump could put that away in the next 3 weeks.
Why isn't Senator Cruz on the Trump train?
Well, a lot of people may not have noticed they had a very aggressive campaign for a year.
Well, I understand, but he had an aggressive campaign against Ben Carson, against Chris Christie. I mean,
he did.
What, is it just personal? I mean, you say Republicans want to win. You say Donald Trump's going to be the nominee. I don't understand. What is Senator Cruz waiting for?
Well, there's 138 days left, so I guess we'll have a little water pass under the bridge. But also, I think it's important. We were campaigning aggressively about the direction of the country and the conservative movement and representing those values. We had a strong conversation about that for over a year. And so I think it's okay for everybody to take stock and see how the campaign plays out and have the Trump campaign win over our votes and help put everybody in the same wagon.
Donald Trump suggested the other day that he thought Jeb Bush and Ted Cruz were behind some of these efforts to whip up delegates. Do you have that same suspicion?
Well, I don't know. I mean, Ted Cruz was the only former candidate who requested a private meeting room in the convention center where the committee meetings are going to be. That meeting was denied.
The request for the room.
The request from the room.
Who denied it? Who made the decision?
The convention did.
The convention. Who's that?
Well, that's a very big thing that's happening in Cleveland.
Yeah. Would you like to say that you personally denied it?
No, I would tweet it if I did.
Right.
But I'll tell you what I'm interested in is seeing that this thing peters out with a very strong and positive campaign that gets down to the very important distilled messages that Donald Trump knows very well. The most important one is you either are for change or you're for more of the same. 8 more years of Barack Obama. I think you saw some of that in this speech yesterday, and I think more. Some of these, for example, the conference calls that they're having, trying to gin up this dump Trump movement. They're talking about 400 people being on that call. I mean, frankly, 280 of them stayed on for less than a minute.
How do you know that?
I just know somebody who was watching the feed. So
it must be the same information that you got that we requested a meeting room,
Jeff,
which is not correct.
Not correct.
No, I would know if we did, and we didn't.
We're going to have to hash that out.
We will.
Yeah.
Who made that request?
It said it came from the Cruz effort. So, and listen, there's nothing wrong with requesting a meeting room in a building.
It was the same day that his father shot JFK, I think, maybe.
Jeff Rowe, who's the second most likely Republican nominee?
Oh, I don't think there is one. I mean, I think that Trump's our nominee, and I think that he has an opportunity in the next few months to to put all of us in the same wagon and see and carry us to victory.
Jeff, you just said that the Dump Trump movement was 50% more organized and better financed than you would have hoped.
Than those watching would have hoped.
Right, sure. but so it's a real thing in your opinion, right? I think almost everybody who's watching this assumes that at least part of the reason why Ted Cruz has not endorsed Donald Trump is that he wants to keep his options open. He wants to be in a position where if that movement does gel, he could be the beneficiary of it in Cleveland. Are you saying there's no truth to that at all?
No, I mean, we suited up. We got in the race, raised $93 million, won a dozen states, put it all on the field every single day. There's no, we're not in the jungle with a knife behind our, in our teeth, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. That's not the case. It's just taking some time. There's others that are doing the same thing. And I think it's important. The conservative values that the senator holds very dear and he campaigned on, really for his career, but for sure in this campaign, are very important to him. And so at some point, I'm sure the two of them will get in a room and discuss some of their differences and where they can agree, and we'll see what comes out of that meeting. That's not happened. But I think it will take that to have any kind of conversations moving forward.
All right, Mr. Jeff Rowe, Mr. Michael Caputo, ding dong. Thank you both for coming on, and we'll be right back.
Nothing more fun than waiting for election results, and they'll be coming in relatively soon and into the night. So you can always go to our website, BloombergPolitics.com. You can read the latest. And also there's a Business Week magazine exclusive interview with the President of these United States, Barack Obama. John Micklethwaite, Megan Murphy, and Ellen Pollack interviewed the President. He's had lots to say about lots of stuff, some about his family, some about the economy. Check it out.
Watch Bloomberg TV special coverage throughout the night and early morning on the Brexit referendum results. It's really important. We're going to cover it here better than anyone. Still kind of hoping that things get a little funky there. Until tomorrow, sayonara.
watching special coverage of Britain Decides. I'm Betty Lou here in New York. History unfolding before our very eyes. We await the results of one of the most important votes in British and European history. Will the UK stay in the European Union or break the political and economic relationship that's lasted more than 4 decades? It is 11 p.m. in London and the polls have now been closed.